When you hear the word power, what's the first thing that pops into your head? A protest? Maybe a president giving a speech? Well, in this explainer, we're going to peel back the layers on that very idea. And we're going to discover that power, it's often strongest where we least expect to find it. So let's kick things off with what we think we already know about power. Usually, this is the image we have, right? Power as a visible struggle. People in the streets challenging their governments. And yeah, this is absolutely a form of power, no question. But it's really just the tip of the iceberg. This is power as obvious, physical force. But what if I told you that power is also operating in the very fabric of the t-shirt you might be wearing right now? That question might seem a little weird, but it gets right to the heart of how anthropologists see power. It's not just a clenched fist, it's like an invisible hand that's constantly shaping our world. All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to unpack the different layers of power. Then we'll dig into that classic battle between ruling by force versus ruling by persuasion. After that, we'll see how modern states literally govern by the numbers. And finally, we'll dive into two really fascinating case studies from Sri Lanka and Thailand that show power popping up in places you'd never think to look. Okay, first step, the idea that power isn't just one thing. It's complex, it's layered. And to get a handle on this, we're going to turn to anthropologist Eric Wolf. He broke it down for us into three totally distinct modes, going from the superpersonal all the way to the global. First, we've got interpersonal power. This is the most straightforward kind, the one we all recognize. It's one person's ability to make another person do something they want them to do. Think of a boss giving an order to an employee. It's direct, it's clear. Next up, there's organizational power. This is less about one specific person and more about the rules of the game in a certain environment. Think about all the procedures in an office or the rules of a university. They set limits on what everybody inside that organization can and can't do. And this brings us to the biggest, most invisible level of all, structural power. This is the power that organizes the social settings themselves. It's what determines who does what kind of work on a global scale. And hey, this is what connects all the way back to that t-shirt example. Structural power is the invisible system that connects low-wage garment factories in one country to the retail stores in another. It's the very architecture of the global economy. So now that we see these different layers, let's look at how power is actually used. Any ruler, whether we're talking about a king or a CEO, really faces a choice. Do you rule by force, or do you convince people to follow you willingly? The thinker Antonio Gramsci gave us two really powerful concepts to help us understand this choice. On the left side, we have domination. That's just ruling through brute force and coercion. And it works, sure, but it's costly, it's unstable, and people will eventually resist. But on the right, we have hegemony. This is way more subtle. This is persuading people to accept the ruling ideology as just common sense, as if it's the natural and only way for things to be. To see hegemony in action, let's take a look at the Azande people of Central Africa. They have a very strong belief that witchcraft is only ever used by people who are envious of others. Now, this might just seem like a simple belief, but check out its political effect. It makes it literally unthinkable for a chief to be accused of witchcraft, because, as the Azande say, why would chiefs envy their subjects? The belief system itself protects the power structure. No police required. That is hegemony. Okay, let's switch gears to a uniquely modern kind of power. How do today's massive nation-states manage to keep track of and, well, manage millions and millions of citizens? I mean, it's a huge logistical challenge, right? You can't just rule by domination alone, and those old forms of hegemony aren't really enough. Modern states needed a whole new technology of power. And here it is. It might look incredibly boring, but the census and statistics in general are one of the most powerful tools of the modern state. By counting and categorizing its population, the state makes its people knowable and therefore governable. The philosopher Michel Foucault called this kind of power biopower. It's a form of power that focuses on managing life itself, the health, the welfare, the birth rates, the productivity of the entire population. The state starts to think of its citizens as a kind of resource, something to be managed for the good of the social body as a whole. So, here's how it works in a four-step process. First, the state collects data. Tons of it. Second, it analyzes that data to see how the population is doing. Third, it intervenes with policies, things like public health campaigns or economic plans, to try and improve things. Foucault called this whole art of governing governmentality. And it's the quiet logic that runs pretty much our entire modern world.
All right, let's see how these different forms of power play out in the real world. Our first case study takes us to the very complex political history of Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka gives us a really stark example of how a state can wield all these different types of power at once. On one hand, the government used coercive force. We're talking outright violence against minority groups and even its own dissenters. But at the same time, it tried to build consent, a kind of hegemony, by promoting this powerful story of nationalist glory. The amazing insight here, though, is that these forms of power can be really fragile and unpredictable. The very story the state used to try and unify people was actually adopted by villagers to fight each other, which ultimately just undermined the state's control.
For our final case study, we're going to head over to northern Thailand. And this is to see how politics isn't always confined to some official government building. Sometimes it lives right inside the family.
Okay, so in this part of Thailand, society is organized around women. Kinship is traced through the mother's line, that's called matrilineal, and when a couple gets married, the man moves to live with or near his wife's family, that's matrilocal. Now look at the political roles this creates. Men, since they're kind of strangers in their wives' villages, are the ones who get involved in the messy, divisive world of formal electoral politics. But the women, who are at the center of these powerful kinship networks, are the ones quietly maintaining social harmony and, critically, are the key to mobilizing votes. So, the takeaway here is huge. If you only looked at who holds the formal official titles, you'd think men hold all the power. But the anthropological view, which looks at kinship and the whole social picture, reveals that the foundational political networks, the real power, are actually controlled by women. So what this all shows is that power is so much more than just brute force. It's this dynamic process. It's the architecture of our global economy, it's the common sense beliefs we hold dear, it's the statistics on a census form, and yep, it's even the family ties that can determine an election. It's everywhere, operating in ways we can see and in ways that are totally invisible. And that leaves us with one last question. Now that you know what to look for, where can you see these hidden faces of power at work in your own life?